Hello and welcome to American Freethought. I'm John Snyder. This is show number 270 for February 24th, 2019. If you listened to the last episode of this podcast, it would be pretty clear to you that there was a lot I disagreed with in John Gray's book, 7 Types of Atheism. But there was one thing he wrote that, as soon as I read it, it somehow automatically rang true for me. He wrote, "The triumph of Christianity brought with it the near destruction of classical civilization. Libraries and museums, temples and statues were demolished or defaced on a vast scale in what has been described as the largest destruction of art the world has ever seen." So there's been a great deal of debate among historians about how and why Christianity improbably rose to power in the Roman world, and a great deal of debate over how and why Christians, once they gained a little power, went all in on destroying the cultural heritage of their polytheistic fellow citizens. I'd been wanting to read more about this period of history for a while, and as luck would have it, there was a book recently published that tackles this head on. The title of that book is The Darkening Age, The Christian Destruction of the Classical World. Its author is Catherine Nixey, and I was lucky enough to interview her recently. Catherine studied classics at Cambridge and subsequently worked as a classics teacher for several years before becoming a journalist on the arts desk at The Times, where she still works. She lives in London with her husband. Here's my conversation with Catherine Nixey. Catherine, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I really enjoyed this book. Even though the subject is slightly depressing, I have a history of reading books that are fascinating but kind of frustrating at the same time.
Yeah, it's not an optimistic tale.
Yes, but I wanted to start out by asking you to tell us what the Roman world was like during the 1st and 2nd centuries with respect to religion. I mean, I think there may be some misconceptions in the popular culture about what Roman society was like, but what was a typical Roman's religious life like back in those days?
Sure, of course. Well, I mean, liberal would be the first thing. When you think of the Romans in terms of religion, if you think of it at all, you tend to think of them, often it is in context with the Christians, and you think of them in like swords and sandals Hollywood epic, pursuing the nasty Christians who won't believe in their gods to the death and throwing them to the lions. And the Romans are often played by somebody like Peter Ustinov, and they're often fat and they're almost always nasty.
Right.
In reality, Roman religion was an incredibly pluralistic place. So you could worship Isis from Egypt, or you could worship the god Mithras in an underground cave, or you could worship your household gods, or you could worship the emperor himself. And on the whole, it was something that was sort of woven into everyday life, but that didn't, as far as we can tell, didn't lay down rules for how you behaved every day. So you never had a sense that this idea that Christians have that God is watching what you do, the Romans found that very, very strange. They just thought that you give a sacrifice to the gods, and if you're lucky, they'll give you favor, and if you're unlucky, they won't. But equally, you were free as a Roman not really to believe any of it. I mean, quite a lot of them didn't. Some people wrote long treatises saying, well, I'm not going to worship the gods because any god who's so pathetic and whose ego is so fragile that they need a burnt offering from me to be nice to me. I'm not going to respect somebody as needy as that, so I'm not going to give them an offering. And other Romans said, I'm not going to worship the gods because I think everything is made of atoms, and I don't believe in creation by a god, and I don't believe in an afterlife. I think we're just all atoms, particles coming together and moving apart. So it was an incredibly varied picture. It was varied in what you did, and it was varied in what you believed. But I think the thing that characterized it was kind of up to you what you did within certain limits.
Mm-hmm. So I guess really the limit there was the Romans, as I understand in your book, the Romans weren't so much concerned about what people believed, but they were concerned about at least certain minimum behaviors. So you had to observe certain rituals, make sacrifices to the emperor, depending on what century we're talking about, and that sort of thing. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly that. So the thing that's really hard for us to understand is that believing, sacrificing to the emperor was the test for whether or not you were a Christian. And what they kind of didn't care about was whether you believed in your Christian God. So if you were a Christian and you just did whatever sacrifice they asked, if they asked it, they would let you go free. They didn't mind if you believed in God as well. But what they really wanted was when they brought you before a judge, which almost never happened, by the way. But if you were brought before a judge and they said, sacrifice to the emperor, you had to do it, not because they cared a jot what your religious beliefs were, but because not to do it felt to the Romans like treason. So it was akin, say, to not standing up when the national anthem was sung, or maybe even worse, if the national anthem was sung, ostentatiously standing up and walking out of the room. That was how Romans felt if you didn't sacrifice to the emperor, because to them, that meant that you didn't care whether the empire survived and you weren't kind of on board with this great project of Rome.
Mm-hmm. So just to be clear on this, the Romans never persecuted Christians because of what the Christians believed. They only persecuted, or in this case prosecuted, a Christian simply because they were failing to observe the required formalities.
Yeah, it was a kind of an absence of patriotism rather than the presence of another god. They were really easygoing on other gods and they were constantly adopting them. But yeah, it was an absence rather than a presence. And you're right to make that distinction between persecution and prosecution. Much more often it was prosecution of Christians. Although Google hates this. Even now, if you type prosecution of Christians into Google Docs, it underlines it in squiggly red and suggests that you mean persecution of Christians. But that's really to over-egg it.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the Romans had some experience with this kind of thing before the Christians even showed up, because the Jews were, as I understand it historically, the one group in the Roman Empire who had historically had an intolerance of other gods.
Yeah. And the Jews had this sort of special status. They were allowed to, they paid a tax. They paid a specific tax that for a long time went to the temple, and then after the temple was demolished, then went to the emperor. But they were pretty much left alone, and it was understood that they had this unusual god and this strange relationship. But so the Romans were kind of aware of this, what we would call monotheism, and they largely left it in peace. And then, I mean, obviously then they did demolish the temple. But again, that was political rather than religious. They're not doing this stuff because they care about the god. They're doing it because they care about dissent and people looking like troublemakers.
And so I guess when Christianity first came to the attention of Roman society, they looked at it as an offshoot of Judaism?
It's really an interesting question because, it's a big question. When did Christ become to be seen as a Christian rather than a Jew? And it seems really quite early. You get accounts in Suetonius, and they say that, and Tacitus, and they're already describing them as Christians. And they did know that they were from Judaism, but they kind of regarded it as a sort of modern sect, and to be a modern sect in a Roman eyes was to be a less good sect. But yeah, they were totally aware it came in some sense from Judaism, a kind of breakaway group they saw it as, which is a fair way to describe it.
Right. And I guess over the centuries, Christians are not the only group that don't necessarily practice what they preach, let's say. But in the context of your book, if you read the New Testament, you read a lot of verses that say things like, resist not evil, that you're blessed if you're persecuted in the name of Christ. Christ himself supposedly said that his kingdom was not of this earth, and even sowed the seeds of separation of church and state. The New Testament talks about how governments are ordained by God and therefore should be obeyed, etc., etc. So how is it that the Christians ever got any interest in actually running the show? Because everything in the New Testament seems to indicate that the world is the world, and Christian belief is Christian belief, and the two really aren't supposed to mix.
I know, it's interesting, isn't it, that the New Testament has this idea of sort of clasping your hands and retreating and singing hymns. That's the kind of picture you get.
Right.
But the thing that you can easily forget with Christianity is that it also comes with the Old Testament. And I think that's the bit that a lot of people would rather have forgotten. And the Old Testament is pretty clear about what you should do, and it's not very friendly. You know, the Old Testament God is a notoriously jealous and vengeful God. And that is the God that says that you should get rid of all idol worship, you should demolish temples so that no stone stands upon another one. You get in Deuteronomy this very ferocious passage saying what you should do with everyone who isn't Christian. And so that's part of it. But I mean, I guess the main thing is it's less that Christianity acquired power and more that power acquired Christianity. So this Emperor Constantine is the moment at which it all changes. So till Constantine, in the start of the 4th century, most people in the Roman Empire had not been Christian. I mean, the image you get from Hollywood films is that everyone is just waiting, all the Christians are waiting, terrified of being persecuted, waiting for the moment when they can be liberated and practice Christianity. And it's really not the case. So at the time when Constantine converts in the 4th century, under 10% maximum of an empire of 60 million are Christian. 90% are not Christian. And most of those 90% aren't even interested in the Christians. So the idea that everyone wanted to persecute the Christians is real rubbish. You see in the accounts, Christian accounts, for whether or not we can believe them, who can say, but this is what Christians thought was plausible. You will have Christians being brought before Roman governors, and the Roman governors will try again and again to persuade them not to make martyrs of themselves. They'll say, you know, go on, just sacrifice a tiny bit to the gods. You don't have to do a full-blown sacrifice. Just dip your fingers in the incense. Mm-hmm. And there's another one. There's a wonderful one where he says, look outside. It's such a sunny day. If you persist in this, I'm going to have to execute you and you'll have no fun. And there's another one where he tries to, my favourite one is where a Roman governor has a Christian brought before him and he says, and the Christian says, I want to die. And the Roman governor says, oh, come on. And he says, you know, you just have to do a tiny, tiny sacrifice, not even a big one, no blood, no nothing, just ashes. And the guy says, no, I want to die for my God. And the governor says, well, look, how about I pay you? And then you can be, you know, then you can just do the sacrifice, take the money and then go. And the guy says, no. And then the governor says this amazing thing. He says, okay, I understand that your God wants you not to give in, but your God will know that I am forcing you. So you can sacrifice. It's my fault, not yours. And then you can go free. And the guy still says no. And it's an amazing kind of level of psychological persuasion that you're getting, and a real picture of how Christians would believe that the Romans wanted to let them go free.
It really makes it sound like the judge wanted to get on with his day, and he thought that executing a Christian would really be a downer.
I mean, that is precisely the impression you get. You get this kind of, oh God, you get the sense that the Christians turn up and you get a real kind of sense of the Roman officials sighing, going like, oh God, not another one. And there's actually a historical account that I have it in the book, but there's a governor in Asia. And he executes a couple of Christians because you have to if they're causing trouble. Presumably they were causing trouble. Or they'd come before him in some way and refuse to sacrifice to the emperor. So then the next day it says all the Christians in the province turn up, and the governor just turns to them and he says, you wretches, if you want to die, haven't you got cliffs you can jump off? Haven't you got ropes you can hang yourself with? You know, this real sense of, God, leave me alone.
Right. You point out that one of the things that makes the interaction of Christians problematic with the rest of the Roman world is their literalism, and specifically literalism with respect to demons. You have a whole chapter devoted to how the early Christian fathers literally demonize their opposition. They claim that the Roman and Greek gods aren't just false gods, but that they are literally demons, and that people who worship them, or people who opposed Christian rule, were literally possessed by demons or doing the bidding of demons. I mean, surely the polytheists believed in spirits and demons.
Oh yeah, they did. Well, the demon word doesn't crop up so much. It kind of appears a couple of times in Greek philosophy. But polytheists, yes, did believe in demons, but I guess the difference that comes with Christianity is that the armies get lined up in a way, these supernatural armies. So with Christianity, it's really us and them, whereas the polytheists exist in this big fug where pretty much anything can be good or bad in its terms of its spirit. Whereas Christianity suddenly says, we are good and anything and everything else is not just not correct or not good, but literally demonic. And once you get that, and the tales of demons that you read with the Desert Fathers, so St. Anthony goes out and he fights demons. And if we say now somebody is fighting their demons, we mean it very metaphorically. Mm-hmm. But when they talked about Anthony fighting demons, he's literally having lions and serpents and wolves coming through the air at him, and he gets so attacked he's black and blue, and the walls of his cave dissolve and they come through, streaming through. So there was a genuine belief that these demons existed, that they could do you harm, and that if you didn't do the right thing they would get you. And this gets woven in not just into Christian writings but into Christian thought, and also then into the laws. You know, those who are not Christian are demonic, they are sick, they are pernicious, they're, you know, genuinely maleficent humans who can do you harm by the very act of what they're worshipping. And that's the real danger. So you go from a point where I might worship Isis, you might worship the Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and they might worship Christianity. Okay, I don't like it, but I let them get on with it. And to a point where if you don't worship this one God, you are literally sort of pulling apart the fabric of the world and allowing this chink of the demonic to come through. And you yourself are possessed by demons. And that is when people start to be seen as less than human, less worthy of respect, less worthy in later years of life than you are yourself.
Mm-hmm. And of course, as bad as demonizing people was, one of the long-lasting aspects of the Christian transformation, if you want to call it that, of the Roman world was the loss of its cultural heritage. You point out that if you think that the gods are literally demons, then the statue of the god can't just be now viewed as a piece of artwork. It has to be viewed as an actual vessel of the devil or some sort of vehicle by which the demons can still render influence or something. Talk a little bit about what the Christians just went in and literally dismantled buildings and destroyed statues down to their dust.
Yeah, so this is the amazing thing. The one example sort of shows quite well in Alexandria, the city of Alexandria, which was probably one of the most beautiful cities in the world at the time, certainly the most learned, the most cultured. And at the top of this city, there stood up above 100 marble steps this temple called the Temple of Serapis. And I wrote about this in the book, but in those days when they want to talk about what are the beautiful buildings in the world, the writers of this period, they don't talk about the Parthenon, they don't talk about the Pantheon, they certainly don't talk about the Colosseum. They talk about this building and they say it is so incredibly beautiful. The statues are so lifelike, they look like they might draw a breath. It's dazzling marble on dazzling white steps above Alexandria and its coastline. And then in 392 AD, a horde of Christians led by a bishop go up and tear it down. And they smash its statues, and then they take the statue of the god that was in the middle and they take it to that amphitheatre in the city. And they've torn it limb from limb, and then they burn it in front of a crowd. And this happens in several cities across the empire, and statues are often bear the brunt of the attacks. So their noses get, classical statues of classical gods, their noses get chopped off, their eyes get gouged out, if they're naked, their breasts are attacked. And the reason that it's happening is because they are believed, in some sense, to be demonic. They're idols to evil gods who can do you harm and they can lead other people astray. And they get smashed. And of course, there's complicated things going on here. So not everybody who took a hammer to a statue believed that it held a demon. You know, some would have been people who were enjoying having a bit of fun smashing up a statue. Others would have been people who, even if they didn't think it was a demon, thought that it was a representation of a wrong religion, you know. So, but what happens is this huge devastation of the old temples and the old centers of the city in the late 4th century, to such an extent that even the Christians at one point pass a law saying you've got to stop tearing down the temples in this city because the city's starting to look a mess. So and they tread this kind of funny line between pragmatism and then they also, a lot of them steal the statues. So some of the Christians sort of say, oh, it's a terrible demonic statue, and then obviously it's also one of the most beautiful statues in the town. I'll take it into my house and I'll de-demonize it by having it in my front hall.
Right. You also talked about in the book how this erasure of pre-Christian Roman culture was so complete that, for example, when archaeologists began excavating Pompeii and Herculaneum, and exposing some of the sexual illustrations that, you know, the Romans were very frank about sex and much freer about it than Christians were, that it just completely shocked people.
Yeah, well, because the Roman attitude to sex generally just horrified the Christians, and you would have had no inkling from the texts that had survived. Basically, there's a couple of poems of Catullus that are quite what's the word, vivid.
Yeah.
But they were never translated really into English or into the vernacular. You know, if they were in an English book, they'd either be left out untranslated, or they'd be translated into Greek or into Italian, which are considered the sort of languages where you're allowed to say this sort of thing because they're Greeks and Italians, and that's what they do. But mainly the literature had been kind of glossed over. So in schools for centuries, people would study Julius Caesar, talking about his Gallic wars, or you'd study Thucydides. You would not study the really rude Greek plays where the women talk about going on a sex strike and everyone jumps about in phalluses. And you wouldn't study the more extreme poems of Catullus or the rude poems of Martial where he's commenting on women's bodies naked in the baths. And then, they kind of get away with this. So everyone assumes that Rome was this sort of slightly genteel, very military place. And then they start to excavate Pompeii. And there is just no getting away from the fact that there are pictures of people having sex, all kinds of sex, lesbian sex, what we would call homosexual sex, absolutely everywhere. And not just in brothels. At first they said, oh, these houses with the paintings of people having sex everywhere, they're brothels. But it later became completely apparent that they weren't brothels. They were just like in your front room. You might have a picture of a huge wall painting of a couple having sex. And they would have phalluses everywhere engraved into the pavement. And everyone tried to find out reasons for this. They say, oh, the phalluses are to keep away the evil eye. And they really weren't. They just liked having a lot of phalluses around.
Right. Well, I guess we should also point out that the Roman view of sex was not completely innocent and egalitarian. You point out in the book that while nothing much was prohibited, the pagans were every bit as chauvinistic as the Christians. There was nothing worse than falling in love with a woman, and there was nothing more embarrassing for a man than to be the receptive partner in a homosexual act.
Yeah, definitely. And they were also, I mean, you didn't want to be a Roman slave in a house with anyone. And you know, there's an extraordinary account by Horace the poet talking about just, you know, feeling an urge to have sex and just grabbing the nearest passing slave boy or girl. I mean, the Christians brought in a lot that was bad, but I mean, in some ways a lot that was good. And one of the good things they brought in was a sense that girls oughtn't to marry or oughtn't to have children until they were 15 or so past their first period, which the Romans had kind of no qualms about. They would marry and start instantly having sex with girls of age 12 with the predictable disastrous consequences.
Right. So in addition to the destruction of architecture and sculptures and artwork, the Christians were also pretty thorough in destroying, as you pointed out, literature. It was kind of shocking, the statistic of how much Latin literature we think has been lost.
Yeah, I know. So the figure that the scholars who study this say is 99% has gone. So when you think of the Christian church, you think of these scribes carefully copying out the classical texts and saving them. And that is true, but you have to remember that they only saved 1% of it. 99% just went. And there was a little bit of it that was, some of this was spiteful. So there was the occasional bonfire, there was the occasional erasure of a text. It was more commonly an erasure of a text that they didn't like. They would wipe it out and write over it. But the vast majority of the losses were simply that Christian scribes either didn't understand or weren't interested in the texts of a culture that they didn't respect and didn't know how to comprehend. So they weren't interested in copying out texts by Archimedes, say. So one of the last Archimedes, the Greek mathematician, came very close to discovering calculus that where he got to wouldn't be surpassed until Newton. And that there was one final text of his that contained his workings that showed that he'd just come within a hair's breadth of discovering calculus, and it was wiped out and written over with a prayer about how to purify your wine of demons if something fell into it. And I mean, it's just that kind of story happens again and again. And most classical texts that we have survived by a thread, by one copy, by two copies, by three copies only, that were caught in the Renaissance, in that amazing period when suddenly people started walking around the monasteries and retrieving manuscripts from piles of scrap paper where they were often being used to light fires or just allowed to rot away.
Mm-hmm. You also talk about how this early Christian prudishness continued on for many, many centuries, even after the Enlightenment and so forth. That even into the 20th century, there were works of Greek or Roman literature that continued to be either purposefully mistranslated, I guess, watered down, or as you pointed out, translated into Italian or something that an English reader couldn't read. But it took a long, long time for Western academia to get over the kind of prescriptions that the early Christian censors put in place.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's one famous poem of Catullus that wasn't correctly translated, and it's partly, I don't know what rating your podcast is, but I probably won't.
Say whatever you want.
Oh, okay. So there's a poem of Catullus. I've forgotten which number. I think it's 16. But the first line is, "I will bugger you and I will fuck your mouths." Right now, in Latin,
right?
It's such a concise language. Latin. There's just one word for "I will fuck your mouths," but it took them till I think it was 1980 something before they correctly translated that. And when I was at school, I had a book of Catullus, and the book that I had, it had just said that this poem was a fragment. So that line had been left out, and then it goes on to the rest of the poem, and it's an interesting poem actually, because his point is he's attacking his critics who assume that he is badly behaved because his poems talk a lot about sex, and his point is to say, just because my poems talk about this doesn't mean that I am it. You should separate the writer from his work, that you can't, as a kind of death of the author thing. Mm-hmm. But what was really interesting was that the Christians in the Christian world were completely unable to do this. They couldn't see it as just a work of literature. They considered that Catullus was filthy. He was, and the whole thing was completely off limits. And certainly, and I have a bit of sympathy for this actually, certainly if you were a kind of, most of the people who were learning Latin or Greek were all boys being taught in school by all male teachers.
Right.
I can imagine that they're just the embarrassment that they might have felt having to explain all of this.
Right. Yeah. I can remember when I was in high school, I had a couple of semesters of Latin, and one of the first things that we wanted to know how to say in Latin was, "Will you have sex with me?" Or it was something like that. I can't remember now what the exact phrase was, but yeah, I can easily see where minds will go.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can just picture these sort of, English public school teachers, awkward, probably unmarried,
right.
not wanting to go.
Straight out of a Monty Python skit.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. One of the other things that I found interesting was that the early Christians, as they wiped away the Roman cultural heritage, they weren't just replacing it with something of their own, like with their own intellectualism. The Roman critics of early Christianity repeatedly talked about how exasperating it was that the Christians just reveled in being ignorant and not knowing anything.
Yeah, you get these wonderful quotes from Christian authors saying things like "wisdom is foolishness," and the problem with Christianity was that the whole religion was caught by its sacred texts, which, as Roman philosophers never tired of pointing out, were written in a really idiotic, they thought, style. So this is supposed to be the word of God, but it's full. It's if you read the Latin of the Greek of the Bible, it's very, very simple. It's often grammatically kind of low class, so they're using words like I don't know what the American, if it kind of translates in American English, but like they would say settee rather than sofa.
Oh, right.
You know, serviette rather than napkin. They're not using the high class words, and they're also getting the endings of the Greek wrong, so that things aren't agreeing quite as they should, and they're using these ticks that are obviously lower class, which is what you'd expect, because the Bible is the work of not very literate, not very well educated men in the Greek diaspora. But this is a problem for the Christians, because this is supposed to be the word of God, and if this is the evidence, God can't do grammar.
Right. Yeah.
That's embarrassing, because he's omniscient, but he doesn't seem to know his endings. So they get caught in this terrible problem, and so and they celebrate ignorance. Is one reaction to this, is they celebrate ignorance, and they say it doesn't matter if it's in simple language, that's on purpose so that everybody can celebrate it and you don't have to know loads. And in a way, you know, it has a very genuine cause as well. It's a noble desire that religion shouldn't be beyond the reach of anybody. It's this wonderful idea that anyone, however humble, can have their relationship with God. But the downside of that is it can make you look pretty stupid if your texts are badly written, badly spelt, very simplistic, and don't get anything, don't get philosophy, don't understand anything, don't understand any allusions, and they're taken in a very literalistic, simplistic way by people who really believe that Jonah spent that long in the belly of the whale. And so then what you get is a Christian reaction. And it's constantly going between reaction and counter-reaction, where they're trying to then graft on the learning of the classical world onto their own religion so that they can convert the upper classes. Because they're very aware that the upper classes of the Roman Empire don't want to convert to a religion that they consider to be for idiots and common people.
Right.
And you get these great quotes from St. Augustine where he says, you know, why would I want to be what my doorkeeper is rather than like a Sophocles or a Cicero? You know, he's aware that people want to be like Sophocles and Cicero, not like their doorkeeper or their slave. But that's what Christianity can offer. So then Christianity starts to kind of have this big wrestle with itself, and it doesn't find it easy. It doesn't find it easy to appropriate these texts, which are, in its eyes, very often filthy and very often critical of their beliefs, and so that you get this interesting interaction.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, I found it sort of unsettling how contemporary to 21st century America some of the criticisms of the Romans were about the anti-intellectualism of the Christians. I know you don't have to deal with this as much in the UK, but here in America, something like a fourth of the population identifies as fundamentalist Christian, and they do not believe in evolution. They deny climate change literally by rationalizing that only God is powerful enough to control the weather, and that mankind couldn't possibly have enough power to change the weather. And they are literally, I mean, I've encountered these people personally. They are literally suspicious of book learning, of experts, of specialists, anybody that has PhD or any kind of letters after their name. And it's so weird when I'm reading your book, some of the quotes from, I can't think of their names right off the top of my head, but some of the Roman critics, I thought, my God, they could have written that about America in 2019.
It's so interesting, isn't it? And it's that kind of collision between a thought world that is given to you and laid down, and it has these very precise parameters and it never changes. And then that what we would call the Enlightenment thought world that says, but is, that's constantly saying, but is it really? And how can we find out? And how can we know? And I think that is one of the real things that you see in say someone like Celsus or Galen, the great scientist. They are baffled by this new religion that considers that it has all knowledge in this book that they find particularly stupid, by the way. Mm-hmm. But that they won't deviate from it. They won't hear. And Galen says he's trying to insult. Galen's constantly trying to insult all other doctors and occasionally other people. He drags other people in by way of metaphor. And to insult one particular group of doctors, he basically says they're as stupid as the Christians. They won't change their mind on anything. They won't believe anything. Like trying to teach them something new is like trying to teach a Christian something new.
Right.
And you get this, what you're describing, this total sense of bafflement from people who want to find out as much as they can through sort of experimentation in Galen's case, or just philosophizing, and then people who won't change their mind ever.
Yeah. I also found it disturbingly contemporary how frequently the critics of the early Christians, as you pointed out, they dismiss it as being sounding ignorant and silly, and they sort of underestimate the tenacity of the Christians. And of course, the next thing they know, the Christians are running the show. And here in America, we've seen almost exactly a similar kind of thing happening.
I know. And it's interesting, isn't it? And you realize that they were criticizing the wrong thing, that it was never an intellectual argument, and that they just got it wrong. They thought they could argue their way out of it. And it was, and the sort of chilling thing about it is that they eventually realized too late this was never a philosophical argument that they were having. They were never going to win by pointing out the flaws in Genesis or, and I've had discussions with Christians like that, and you suddenly realize there is nothing you can say because it's not about that. It's not about arguing points of logic.
There was a documentary that came out not too long ago where they interviewed a Christian minister. He wasn't a very well-educated man, but he said something like, if you showed me in the Bible where it says 2 + 2 = 5, yes, I'm going to go with the Bible.
Yeah.
And how can you argue with that? You can't.
Exactly. That's precisely it. Yeah. He put it really well from the other side, but really well.
Yeah. You touched on this earlier, but something that has thoroughly penetrated the popular understanding of ancient Rome is the idea that Christianity triumphed despite being persecuted. That Christians were crucified or burned at the stake or thrown to the lions by the tens of thousands. And, there's no doubt that some Christians were treated in that way. But what is the current consensus on the actual extent of Christian persecution and the motivations behind it?
Mm-hmm. Very low, in short. So not tens of thousands, not even thousands, probably hundreds. It was extremely sporadic for the most part. So Christians had to live in a Roman Empire that didn't have a Christian at the helm for 300 years. Of those 300 years, the first 250 pretty much passed in peace, occasional persecutions, and it was only in around 250 that there were any imperial attacks on Christians. And then they were few and far between. They petered out very quickly. The Roman officials generally felt they had better things to do, and also they didn't like making martyrs because they were aware that it was such bad PR. And until 250, the general attitude was, with a couple of exceptions, was they should be left in peace. There's a wonderful series of letters written by an author called Pliny. Now, Pliny's most famous for having seen the eruption of Vesuvius, which he saw with his uncle, also called Pliny. But one of his other most famous letters was written to the Emperor Trajan. So Pliny was out as a governor in Bithynia and Pontus, which is modern day Turkey. And becomes aware that there's real unrest in his area between the local non-Christian population and some Christians. And he writes to Trajan and he says, "What shall I do?" And and it's really interesting for many reasons. So Pliny tortures a couple of the Christians who are not citizens. So this kind of persecution did happen. And he tortures them because there's unrest. So he doesn't want his province. It's his job to make sure his province is peaceful. And there's local unrest. So he brings in the Christians, tortures them, and says, "What are you doing?" And he's also interested because he thinks that the Christians are committing crimes. And one of the crimes that the Christians were infamous for committing was cannibalism. The Eucharist was misunderstood. And when it was said, "This is my body, this is my blood, eat my body, drink my blood," it was believed that they were really eating the body and blood of somebody who had been there. So that was one reason why the Romans were suspicious of them. Anyway, he tortures them to find out if this is true. He doesn't think it is true. We assume that's what he thinks. He doesn't say. He says unspecified crimes he's finding out about. And then he writes to Trajan because more and more Christians are being reported to him, and it's quite clear he doesn't want to execute more of them. He doesn't want to get his hands bloody in this way. He sends the citizens off to Rome who are Christians to be tried because they have the right to have a proper trial in Rome. And other than that, he says to Trajan, "What shall I do? Large numbers of people are going to be in danger if I continue prosecutions." And so Trajan says, in effect, he says, "Don't. If they are brought before you and they are Christian and they won't sacrifice to the emperor, then the genius of the emperor, then they do have to be executed because, in effect, that's treason. But don't go hunting them out." He says, his words are, "These people must not be hunted out." And he says, "You must not believe anonymous tales that are brought to you because it's quite against the spirit of our age." And so that's in about 111 AD. And then for the next 100 years after that, they have some serious protection from that encounter. And that continues until 250 AD when the situation changes again. And that's when you get a couple of imperial persecutions, the Galerian and a couple later, and then you get what's called the Great Persecution. But even the Great Persecution just isn't that great. It's not that big. It's nothing compared to what will happen later when the Christians take control.
Right. Something else that really struck me was that, again, it's one thing for the Christians to take political power and social power, but they also seem to get into this, I don't think death spiral would be an exaggeration, of being anti-joy, anti-fun, anti-pleasure, anti-anything that would set your mind at ease. It was like this weaponizing of sadomasochism that, whoever could be the most bitterly pious one. Why do you think that happened? Because if a reading of the New Testament, a plain reading of the New Testament, I mean, yes, they talk about how the world is a place of futility, but, Jesus drank and ate and partied. So there's really no reason to think that automatically that a Christian rule would be such a joyless hellscape.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? There is this real celebration of the abnegation of the body, the starving. You get these amazing accounts. They're great fun of monks who stand in the desert for 7 years with stones in their mouths, or who purposefully get themselves horribly sunburnt in the desert, and then because they decide that one of them, what is it? He fantasizes about a cucumber or something, and then he eats a bit of cucumber, and then he's so angry with himself. He then spends 7 days getting sunburnt till his skin blisters off him in the desert as a punishment for this. And you have other ones who live on like a few grains of rice till their eyes go dark and their skin starts peeling off. It's really fabulous, fabulous stories. Why it happened is a real puzzle. I mean, there was schools of Greek and Roman philosophy that said that you should, ignore your body, that, you don't want to give in to your passions. But they do take it that step further, and you get these wonderful stylites, people who spend years and years standing on a big tower of rock until their feet burst and their spines collapse and all sorts of revolting things. Why it happens, I mean, it is very peculiar. There is the idea, as you say, that this world is nothing, and that the less fun you have in this world, the more reward you will have in the next. But, I mean, I think you would be hard pushed to predict, if you knew all the starting circumstances of Christianity and you ran a computer program and put them in. I think you would have to run it a few times before you got this. It just seems to have been a quirk that happened, and then once it had started, it really took off. And it lasted, so my father was a monk. My mother had been a nun. My father was a monk. And when he was a monk, he would, as a 20-year-old, sort of, as a Catholic monk in Yorkshire in England, he would starve himself thinking that, this made him more holy. So it had a long history. Yeah,
that's someday when you have time, I'd love to hear about your father the monk and your mother the nun. It sounds like this opening of a joke, but it's not.
Yeah.
You talk about in the book the shocking swiftness, at least from a historical standpoint, with which once Christianity gained the upper hand, what we call paganism nowadays, polytheism, was just obliterated. They literally outlawed polytheism and even declared at least once that it was extinguished, even if it wasn't really true. But do we have any idea when when historically was the last actual public pagan observance? When did it really die out?
I would love to know that. You hear of temples in, I think, still being celebrated. Islands survive longer. Paganism lasts longer on islands, and it lasts longer in the countryside. And you hear reports from the 8th century that it's still going strong. I think on Malta, I think it still survives. And of course, if the Catholic Church were more honest with itself, it would admit that a lot of what it does today has roots in what were pagan rituals. There's great debate. A very obvious one is Christmas. So lots of scholars will deny that Christmas has anything to do with the Saturnalia. But it's difficult not to see that a festival that was celebrated on the 25th of December, that was celebrated with holly and ivy and general present giving and seeing of families, has nothing at all to do with the fact that Christmas is celebrated on the 25th of December with holly and ivy and present giving in general. The church has very much resisted the idea that it had any pagan influences on itself whatsoever, and it's thick with them, absolutely thick with them. But the last true bona fide pagan, I would say, 8th century. And although I spoke to an archaeologist who said that he had been digging in Turkey and he saw 2 Turkish shepherds who, if you'd asked them, would have said they were Islamic. So that's a whole other sort of resisting the pagans. But he said they were sacrificing sheep in a way that a Roman farmer would have recognized to the mountain goddess. It was amazing. He said they'd put ribbons around it was lambs actually. They put ribbons around their head, and they were sort of sacrificing them, or sort of making them sacred to the goddess in a way that would have been entirely recognizable to a Roman.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing.
Isn't it?
This just occurred to me that despite the Christians' best efforts to completely eradicate the polytheistic world, that we still, to this day, have the days of the week and the months and the months of the calendar come more or less straight out of the Roman world.
Yeah, and the days of the week are really interesting because they're sort of more northern pagans, and they were, the battle against those, that was a whole other, war that was waged against the Viking gods and the northern gods. And I was in North Norway recently for a peace, and they were in the 1850s or so. The church there was attacking the local, what they called pagan rituals, and wiping them out. So, it depends, I guess, which pagans you're talking about. If you're talking about the Roman ones, much earlier, but this was still going on in other areas of the world until much, much later.
I'm also curious to know, now that you've published this book, the kind of reactions that you're getting to it, have you had a lot of, or any, blowback on this? Are there people that think you're kind of selling it too hard, or you're picking on Christians who can't defend themselves anymore, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, Christians are always saying they can't defend themselves, but they're not doing that badly. There are 2 billion of them.
No,
mostly.
I meant the Christians of the ancient world aren't around
I
to
see.
explain themselves,
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, there are definitely, and there is. So my aim in writing this book was just tell a story that hadn't been told. So the good story of Christianity, and there is a lot of good that came from its rise. You know, I mentioned the treatment of women, you know, in many ways improved. But that story is so well known and has been so often told that I was interested in telling the unknown story. And I say at the front of the book, you know, there is another story of the Christian goodness and you know, the story of charity and things like that. That is also true, but it wasn't the tale I was telling. So there are those people who got annoyed with me for not having more of the goodness of Christianity in the book. And I can see that.
Yeah.
You know, but it wasn't, I felt that tale had been told already. I was telling this tale. I wasn't denying that tale at all, but just saying, I think this needs to be heard too. But yeah, there are some Christians who are very cross with me.
No pun intended.
Oh, yeah, no pun intended. No. Will they find it in their hearts to forgive me? I don't know.
Yeah, I guess there are some that would say that they make the argument that polytheism is somehow inferior to monotheism, and of course they always mean Trinitarian monotheism, not
anyone else's.
Exactly. But
mono, not yours.
yeah, that the Christians actually did the world a favor by getting rid of animal sacrifice, ending the gladiatorial games, and supposedly Christianity unified the whole of Europe from a cultural standpoint, at least for a while. So do you think, had Christianity not taken hold in the Roman world, do you think that Europe would now be better off than it currently is, or worse off? Or is it just impossible to say?
So that's a great question. How would history be if we reran it? I don't know. No idea. I would probably say better. Without religious wars, without a sense of religious superiority over another people, without crusades, without religious persecutions, without, some of the real low points in European history are things like crusades or pogroms or are moments when knowledge is suppressed. I mean, ask Galileo. He could have done without it. And I also think, Christianity has written itself a very positive press over the years, as you would expect. And things like, you mentioned gladiatorial games, and you also mentioned animal sacrifice. I mean, one of the things animal sacrifice did was it did at least make it a very big act to kill an animal. You didn't just kill it. It was a huge thing. And one of the things that you hear the early pagans, as we commonly call them, arguing with the Christians about is the Christians say, well, man is the most superior. All animals were created for man. And the pagan said, that's ridiculous. Why are all animals created for you? You could equally say the lion and the wolf eat you, so you're created for the lion. Right. And, it has been argued that one of the reasons why we treated the natural world so very badly was we had this idea it was all made for us by a creator God. But I have a great deal of sympathy with the people who thought that the world was better because of Christianity, because, for about 20 years I thought that too. So I know I can understand it. I just no longer agree with it.
Well, Catherine, I appreciate your time. I thought this book was endlessly fascinating, and I'm going to recommend all of my listeners to go buy it and read it.
Oh, that's very kind of you, and thank you. It's been lovely. It was lovely to speak to you.
That was Catherine Nixey, author of The Darkening Age, The Christian Destruction of the Classical World. I'll put a link in the show notes so you can buy a copy for yourself. And not to take anything away from Catherine's book at all, but if you read her book and you're interested in knowing more about this time period, I also highly recommend a book by Bart Ehrman, who's been on this podcast several times, called The Triumph of Christianity: How a Forbidden Religion Swept the World. You know, as I was reading Catherine's book, I couldn't help but be reminded of things happening in the 21st century that are eerily reminiscent of the things that happened in the 3rd and 4th century in the Roman Empire. There are still shockingly and violently pious people in the world who take their idolatry very seriously. You may recall that ISIS militants destroyed ancient ruins in Palmyra, Syria, and in Mosul, Iraq, and these were widely considered priceless ruins that have now been blown up and may never be recovered or reconstructed. And before that, the Taliban in Afghanistan, right before the United States went in and rooted them out, destroyed 2 giant statues of Buddha. There's been some talk of trying to recreate or reconstruct these statues, but I'm not quite sure what the status of that is. And I was also reminded of a more trivial and perhaps more amusing case. If you go to the Great Hall of the U.S. Department of Justice, you will see 2 impressive aluminum statues. These statues are about 12 feet high. They were installed back in the 1930s. One of them is called the Spirit of Justice, and the other one is called the Majesty of Justice. The Spirit of Justice is a female figure with arms raised up and one exposed breast. The Majesty of Justice is a muscular male figure who's bare-chested except for kind of a loincloth. So 2 former attorneys general of the United States apparently had a problem with these statues. The first one was Dick Thornburgh, who was Attorney General under Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. He had this blue backdrop installed that hid these statues from view. And then after him, some years later, when John Ashcroft was George W. Bush's Attorney General, he had the blue barriers permanently installed. Really, all you need to know about John Ashcroft is that he is a Pentecostal prude. The backdrop was removed a few years later when Ashcroft was replaced by Alberto Gonzalez, who was also under George W. Bush. Now, in fairness, nobody called for these statues to be destroyed, but if a normal person looks at these, they would not think that they were in any way pornographic or offensive or problematic. That said, I don't think there's any doubt that if people like John Ashcroft could truly seize the reins of power in this country, they would like to ban pornography and criminalize anything but married, heterosexual, missionary position sex. And I think the ancient Christians would approve of that. The last thing I wanted to mention, there was a continuation of sorts of the controversy I mentioned last time, where the newly Democratic-led House Committee on Natural Resources wanted to remove the phrase, "So help you God," from the oath required of people speaking before the committee. So I'll just read you a short article published by the Christian Post. A Democratic congresswoman from Colorado chose to omit God when administering the oath to witnesses during a hearing on the Trump administration's family separation policy. Representative Diana DeGette, chair of the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, asked witnesses on Thursday to raise their right hands to be sworn in. She left out "So help you God" when she asked, "Do you swear that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Immediately after, Representative Jeff Duncan, Republican, South Carolina, pointed out, "Madam Chairman, I believe the oath was incorrect and incomplete." DeGette responded, "This is the oath we use, and this is the oath we're going to use today." The omission comes a week after another Democrat-controlled committee, the House Committee on Natural Resources, was considering a proposal to remove the phrase "So help you God" from its oath. The committee chose not to adopt the change, with Chairman Raul Grijalva, Democrat, Arizona, saying the proposal was a mistake. Representative Jefferson Van Drew, Democrat, New Jersey, said it would be hurtful and harmful to go out of our way to take it out. I do think that we could use a little bit more of God, not less, said Representative Garrett Graves, Republican, Louisiana. I get concerned about the thought that we're not making an oath to something that's higher, something that's bigger, something that is above us. DeGette wasn't the only one to leave out God during a House hearing this week. The day before, Gerald Nadler, Democrat, New York, swore in witnesses at the House Judiciary Committee hearing on gun violence prevention. Representative Mike Johnson, Republican, Louisiana, soon after pointed out that "So Help Me God" was left out. In this case, Nadler apologized and repeated the oath with the phrase, "So help you God." In short, Congresswoman DeGette has more guts than Congressman Nadler and Congressman Grijalva combined. The oath should not include any mention of God for a number of reasons. It serves no purpose in a secular setting like subcommittee hearings. Including it signals to Christians that their belief system is the preferred belief, and it's both pointless and insulting to shoehorn something like that into an oath that might be administered to an atheist or even to a religious person for whom godly oaths are offensive. I'll put information in the show notes telling you how you can support the American Freethought podcast. Please read the show notes. If you want to contact me with feedback, suggestions for future topics or guests, or just to vent, I can be reached at john@americanfreethought.com. That's all for this episode. Until next time, follow me on Twitter or Facebook or visit americanfreethought.com. Thanks for listening.